Welcome to Fertility Friendly Food. I'm your host, Stephanie Velakis, accredited practicing dietitian and nutritionist and director of the Dietologist, an Australian-based practice focused on optimizing fertility through nutrition. This podcast will bring you snack-size episodes for you to learn, grow, and be inspired by the latest research, facts, and practical lifestyle tips about eating well for optimal fertility, helping you cut through the confusion and myths to take back some of the control on your fertility journey, one bite at a time. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Fertility Friendly Food, the podcast. My name is Stephanie Velakis, and I'm an expert fertility dietitian and nutritionist and founder of the Dietologist and your host. And today I'm joined by special guest, psychologist and hypnobirthing practitioner, Rebecca Black from the Mindful Birth Movement. Welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me, Steph.
Now, today's potty episode is all about the fear of birth and how this can sometimes hold us back on our trying to conceive journey. So obviously, before we get a bit deeper into this topic, trigger warning, this podcast episode is going to discuss birth and pregnancy. So if that is not something you want to hear about today, a lot of our listeners are on their fertility journey and might not be in the right headspace to kind of consume this kind of content, which is totally understandable. That's totally fine. Go and find another episode that is going to serve you. We've got lots available in the archives. So without any further ado, Beck, tell us a bit about who you are and what you do at the Mindful Birth Movement.
Yeah, so like you said, I'm a psychologist, a hypnobirthing practitioner. I'm a mum to two beautiful girls. So Stevie's 4 and Aubrey is 2. And I'm the founder and director of the Mindful Birth Movement. Essentially, the Mindful Birth Movement supports women through their conception, pregnancy, birth, and postpartum journey. I provide individual psychological support to women at various stages of their journey. I provide hypnobirthing programs to help women and couples prepare for their birth experience. And I have a signature group program called Mindful Motherhood, which is for women in their postpartum period to gain support with the transition into motherhood. And I guess my biggest aim is to support women to, in the motherhood stage, redefine their motherhood journey, to let go of mum guilt and unrealistic expectations, to tune into their values and feel more calm, confident, and strong.
Oh, that sounds so beautiful, Beck. And even though I am not a mum myself, I empathise so much with the women that I work with that become mums and the different challenges that happen at different phases of motherhood. And I see them struggle with so many of those things that you mentioned. So it's amazing that you have these supports available for those mums and mums to be in this space. So that's incredible. So how did you find yourself in this space of psychology and birth education and supporting mums? And yeah, tell us a little bit about your journey into this world.
Yeah, so prior to becoming a mum, I worked in large government organisations as a psychologist. And then I fell pregnant and I guess started the biggest journey of my life, transitioning through conception issues and trying to fall pregnant to then becoming pregnant and realizing that I was terrified of labor and birth, discovering hypnobirthing, and that really transformed my preparation and my experience of labor and birth. So prior to that, I was terrified of birth, and hypnobirthing really allowed me to completely shift my perspective around birth. And I went into my labor feeling really confident and excited around birth. It didn't go to plan, and I think labor and birth very rarely goes to plan. I actually went into labor 5 weeks early, and it completely caught me by surprise, but I was blown away with how much hypnobirthing supported me to navigate that experience and stay calm despite the chaos that kind of ensued around me during labour. I had a really positive and empowering birth, which I put down to the fact that I did some amazing preparation through my pregnancy. I then transitioned into motherhood, which was probably one of the hardest things I've ever done, and the most rewarding, but definitely such a huge shift in life and a developmental transition for women. And as I guess I was getting to that point in my journey where I had to return from maternity leave, I realized that I didn't want to go back to my large government organization job, and had this real passion for using, I guess, my lived experience to support women on their journey, knowing that 1 in 3 women describe their birth as traumatic, which I think is really heartbreaking, knowing personally that transition to motherhood and how hard that is, and then professionally knowing if you're experiencing trauma from your birth, transitioning to motherhood is going to be even more challenging. So I really wanted to support women and couples to have a positive, empowering birth, feeling strong entering into motherhood and feeling really positive in that space, and then supporting women as a psychologist as they navigate this new stage of their life. So I guess I combine those experiences and the things that I feel really passionate about and started the Mindful Birth movement.
What a beautiful story. And thank you for sharing your own personal experience, because I think many of us could probably relate to some level of fear or anxiety or apprehension about birth and labor, whether you're pregnant or not. Even just you talking about that, I remember when I was a child being so fearful of labor and birth because of what my mum kind of told me of my own delivery, that, yeah, I was actually fearful of getting pregnant at all because I was worried about pain. My thoughts around it have changed now, but this was something that as young as 5 or 6 years old, that was a message that was being sent to me. Obviously, not intentionally my mum trying to scare me out of becoming pregnant, but that's what I got from it. And so I think this is probably a lot more common than what we are probably aware of.
Yeah, I think the social and cultural expectations around birth are very much negative, and you're not the first woman to share with me. We explore this a lot in the hypnobirthing program. Where does our fear come from? And so many women talk about how from such a young age they hear stories, watch television, people talking about birth in a really negative way. So we're conditioned and ingrained to believe that this is something to be feared, something that will be traumatic and painful.
Absolutely. And for those who don't know, you've mentioned hypnobirthing, and you're a hypnobirthing practitioner. What is hypnobirthing and what does it entail? Because I get this question a lot from my pregnant clients when they're looking at birth education programs and they're like, I don't know what all this is about. And I'm like, I understand this much, but I would recommend you explore all your options. So can you give us a snapshot of what is hypnobirthing so our listeners can get a bit of a feel for it?
For sure. And I think I'll start by saying the term hypnobirthing, I don't think does us many favors, because I think a lot of people think it sounds a little bit alternative or quirky or strange. But really, hypnobirthing is a philosophy around labor and birth, with the understanding that women are perfectly designed to birth their babies naturally, assuming that you are healthy and well and your baby is healthy and well. And once you understand your physiology and what happens in your body during labor, you can actually learn to work with your body rather than against it. So having that real knowledge and understanding of that physiological process of labor can make a huge difference in how you navigate your birth. And then hypnobirthing also teaches you a range of skills and techniques, basically giving you a toolbox of strategies to help you cope with the intensity of labor. So you learn breathing techniques, relaxation, visualization, affirmations, so many different things that support you during labor. And probably the thing that I was most drawn to when I learned hypnobirthing myself was how much aligned with my practice as a psychologist. So the techniques that you learn in hypnobirthing aren't just beneficial for birth, they can actually be really wonderful for pregnancy and also really applicable in that postnatal period as well. So it's nothing strange. There's actually a lot of evidence behind it that supports the effectiveness of hypnobirthing to achieve positive or better birth outcomes. Probably one of the common misconceptions is hypnobirthing is for women who just want a natural birth. They want to birth without medication, without intervention, and have this beautiful natural birth, which it certainly supports women with that and helps women achieve that. But hypnobirthing isn't against intervention. It's really against unnecessary intervention, and it supports couples through educating them on their rights, hospital policies and procedures, helping empower them to make informed decisions through labour and to ensure that, I guess, they feel heard, in control and supported.
I agree. I think the name is probably a little bit woo-woo vibes, but it is not, in fact, woo-woo. And in fact, educating yourself on birth using a framework that is not just like, here is what pushing out a baby can look like, or here's what a C-section can look like, but actually talking about strategies and like understanding the systems in which birth occurs in our society, or at least here in Australia, and understanding all of that, and then having that sense of informed choices and having those strategies and almost like scripts, right? Like the words to find to help you in those moments where there is a lot going on physically, mentally, emotionally, all of the is in every which direction. And so it can sometimes feel a bit, I think a lot of people feel like it's a little bit of a chaotic time. So I guess it's about hitting pause and slowing down and thinking about what you want to do in that time, which is really, really a special time.
Definitely, Steph. And I think probably when I talk about birth trauma, I think it's so important to understand that it's often not what happens in your labour. So women might hear a birth story and think that sounds traumatic, but it's not necessarily about what happens during your labour. It's generally around how you feel during labour. So two women could have the exact same birth on paper, both, let's say, going into labour naturally, having lots of intervention and ending in an emergency C-section. The woman who feels prepared, empowered, calm, confident, and in control during that birth generally will end that experience feeling positive about the birth, compared to the woman who might feel unsupported, unsafe, unheard, scared, feeling out of control during that experience. That's where birth trauma often occurs. So I think that preparation and having the tools, the techniques, the knowledge to navigate labour, regardless of how it turns out, has a significant impact on how you then transition into motherhood and feel after the experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Feels like a bit of a light switch moment when baby goes from inside world to outside world, and processing the transition in between, which can sometimes be quick or slow, or, you know, everything in between for people. It's a lot to digest all in a pretty short period of time if we think about it. So, Beck, what are some of the most common misconceptions or fears around birth that you hear? Like in our practice, we see a fair few people who even hesitate about trying to conceive due to their fears around birth and labour. And then they can sometimes then be quite avoidant about seeking education out around birth and labour. And I sometimes encourage them to look at programs like really early, even sometimes before they're even pregnant, to help them just get acclimated to the fact that there are tools and strategies to help them overcome this kind of hurdle. So yeah, I guess I'd be keen to hear your take on what are the common misconceptions and fears around birth that you hear in your work? And what are any of your suggestions to someone who's maybe not even pregnant yet, but this is really holding them back?
Yeah. So I think similar to what we mentioned earlier, that conditioning that we receive from such a young age that causes us to fear birth is so prevalent and so relevant in our journey in terms of conception and pregnancy. I think that a lot of women go into pregnancy and preparing for birth expecting it to be traumatic and painful. I think a lot of women share their negative birth stories, and often it can feel like a bit of a competition as to who had it worse, and almost joking in terms of their birth outcomes, when it's really quite serious and has an impact on women who are preparing to have a baby, or maybe even they're pregnant at the time. So I think that messaging that we often receive, that birth is traumatic and painful. So the fear very much comes from that. Often women talk to me about being quite scared of the pain, feeling like they won't be able to handle it. They might be fearful of a C-section, or their fear might actually cause them to want to book in for a C-section. And just that fear of what could happen in labor and birth, and like I said, the birth trauma and the stories that we hear that can, even birth injuries that are often spoken about. So that's often where the fear sits for women. In terms of shifting away from the fear, I think your recommendations to your women is really important to start exploring what birth can look like outside of that, because there is so much out there around how incredible birth can be. So it's almost like we need to undo that conditioning and retrain our brain and our body to start believing that positive birth is possible. So this can look like watching births videos, listening to positive birth podcasts, exploring the birth education that's out there, and really starting to realize that birth can be a really incredible and positive experience, but it takes work to get to that and to shift your mindset and shift those beliefs. So it is a lot of investment, I guess. And I think you mentioned earlier that sometimes our subconscious or conscious fears around labour and birth can actually impact our conception journey. So working through this even before you've fallen pregnant might be an important step to take.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just before we hit record, I was just saying that I see sometimes people almost self-sabotaging conception, even though they want a baby and they want to become pregnant and they want to try to conceive, but just something always is getting in the way. And when I really dig deeper and ask a few questions, it seems to be that it might be a fear around pregnancy, a fear around loss, a fear around birth, a fear around labor, a fear around what kind of mother will I be? Can I handle this? How's this? Or like a fear of the grief of the current life that you have. Like there's so many things, but I mean, I shouldn't lump them all into one category, but it kind of manifests in the same way that I often see, which is like, oh, I'm not going to track this month, or we're not really trying, but we're kind of trying, but now I'm getting frustrated that I haven't conceived. And it's like, well, let's unpack this more, like what's actually going on here, because we're not going to be able to help you with your goal if we don't understand what's holding you back.
100%, Steph. And there's so much research to support the mind-body connection. And so if our mind, whether consciously or subconsciously, maybe isn't quite ready to conceive or is fearful or worried about all of those things that you just described, our body pays attention to that and is connected to that. So addressing those fears and that hesitation or the worries that come along with falling pregnant, I think, is a really big part of the conception journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we mentioned a couple of things like seeking out education early and all those kinds of strategies. But if we were to go a little bit nitty gritty, and obviously it's going to depend on each individual and all that good stuff, but can you give us some examples of how you support women in breaking through some of these barriers and fears around labour and birth? Let's just keep it small and keep it to that one for now, because there's so many that I just mentioned that we could talk about, but I don't want it to blow out into, I mean, absolutely we could, but yeah, just for conciseness, I think we'll just focus on that element.
If we were to focus on that fear during pregnancy, I think a big part of the piece is education. So understanding what your body does during labour, the physiological process of labour and birth can build up a lot of confidence, knowing what is happening and understanding the sensations that we experience in labour as positive, as helpful sensations, rather than perceiving the intensity or the pain as a negative or a bad thing. So understanding the process can really help reduce fear, and having knowledge of the medical system also can really help you feel more confident in, I guess, navigating the birth space and feeling clear around your birth preferences and what you want and need during labor to experience it in a positive way and feeling supported through labor. And like I mentioned before, that exposure to positive birth stories, you can even start visualizing your own birth and picturing it playing out in a really positive way to increase that belief and confidence in yourself. At a deeper level, hypnobirthing also includes hypnosis, which is probably the part of the program that people are the most uncertain about, I guess. But if I was to give you a really brief intro to hypnosis, essentially what it is 5% of our mind is conscious. So we're talking about some fears that women might have through conception or pregnancy. A lot of those fears are in our subconscious. So we don't actually recognize that they're under the surface impacting our behavior. So you mentioned self-sabotage often comes subconsciously from those fears. Hypnosis essentially allows us in a state of relaxation to access our fears, access our subconscious mind, release things that aren't serving us, and actually implant positive expectations, visualizations, beliefs that allow us, I guess, to overcome our fear and, I guess, believe in positive birth and then go on to achieve a really positive birth experience. So hypnosis can be a really effective strategy to address some of those underlying fears.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to give context to any of the listeners around hypnotherapy, there is plenty of evidence around the efficacy of hypnotherapy in many contexts. The one that always comes top of mind is gut-directed hypnotherapy, which is used in the management of irritable bowel syndrome, which has been just as effective as one of the most popular strategies to use to manage IBS, which is a low FODMAP diet. So, like, as soon as the word hypnotherapy, everyone thinks of the person holding the pendulum and you're getting very sleepy kind of vibe. But hypnotherapy doesn't necessarily look like that. And the power of visualization, I just recently, as an aside, did a visualization for something work-related. And I could not believe when it was 15 minutes, it wasn't very long. I could not believe by the end of it, I was bawling my eyes out. I'm not really a crier either, but it just brought up so much emotion for me in that power of that visualization. And yeah, I'm seeking that out now more about how can I do more of this? Because it really did help cement those thoughts and feelings, I think, as well.
And I think the mind-body connection is so powerful there because hypnosis is about accessing the mind and shifting our thoughts, our beliefs, our views on things, which actually has a correlation with how our body then responds. So in labor, that's super important. But even in business or life in general, how your mind operates influences whether you feel tightness in your stomach or tense in your body, or if you hold back or if you do, it completely drives our whole experience. So the hypnosis, like you said, is evidence-based. It's like a clinical intervention for a lot of different health and mental health issues. So there's lots of evidence behind it. And I guess I always talk about the fact that I'm a psychologist. So whatever I do needs to be evidence-based, and hypnobirthing is one of those things. So it's certainly not alternative or woo-woo. It's definitely grounded in evidence.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why I wanted to get you on, because I often find, when you hear these topics, maybe from a qualified hypnobirthing practitioner, but doesn't have any kind of other health science background, I think sometimes people who are used to the evidence-based world, they're like, oh, but sometimes it can feel really reassuring if somebody who has a career in health already and evidence-based health is dual qualified in this kind of space. It's kind of reassuring, absolutely. So I know you mentioned a little bit around the evidence around hypnobirthing. So can you share with us some of the facts or figures, if you know any off the top of your head, around labor, birth interventions, outcomes overall, or anything else interesting that you've noted? I know my listeners absolutely love a stat or a fact. So I thought I would open up the door and get you to share some of that around hypnobirthing.
100%. So the program I teach is Hypnobirthing International, which is obviously specific to the Australian birthing space, but they collect data from all the couples that complete the program to assess how effective it's been and the benefits of doing hypnobirthing. So the Australian data indicates, this data is a few years old, so it's pre-pandemic, I would say, but the data that we had said that only 12.8% of women had a C-section in Australia compared to the national average of 33%. So there's a significant reduction in C-section rate for the women who completed hypnobirthing as part of their birth preparation. And only 20.43% had an epidural compared to the national average of 46.5%. So that's a reduction in C-sections by 61% and a reduction in epidural use by 56%. Like I said, these stats are a few years old. So I know the C-section rate has increased through the pandemic, so keeping that in mind, but really reassuring information to indicate that this program is a really effective way to prepare for birth. A lot of hospitals are wanting to teach this program and recommending their pregnant mums to go and seek this kind of education, because essentially it makes their jobs a lot easier, because women are coming in feeling more confident, prepared, and birth easier generally because of this kind of preparation. And like I said earlier, hypnobirthing isn't against intervention, it's just against unnecessary intervention. So if you can have a toolkit of techniques to navigate labour before you go down the path of drugs or medical intervention, you're going to likely have a much more positive experience in birth.
Yeah, absolutely. And as well, I think one of the great things that I've learned from the last few years just being in this space and talking with hypnobirthing practitioners is exactly right. It's not anti-intervention, and there is a general appreciation for the unpredictability that labour and birth can thrust upon you. Everything can be looking a certain way all throughout your third trimester, all throughout your pregnancy, in fact, and on the day things can change. And it's not anti-medicine in any way, shape or form. It's about the safety and health of you and your baby first and foremost. So, yeah, absolutely. It's just about understanding all your options. And I think as well, shifting that narrative away from almost like shame around birth interventions and C-section deliveries, and that it's not a badge of honour to have a drug-free, natural, quote-unquote, natural labour in, a water bath if that's not what you want, or if that's not what you desire. So it's about like value alignment as well, which I think is really important to emphasise, because I think that is something that hypnobirthing does really well. And I think sometimes people on the outside don't, I guess there's this image that it's only for people that want to do that, but that's not necessarily true at all, is it?
Definitely not. And thank you for bringing that up. I'm actually a proud C-section mum as well. So my first was a natural birth. My second did not go to plan once again, and I ended up in an emergency C-section. And I think that message of positive, empowering birth doesn't look a certain way. Yeah, it doesn't matter how you birth your baby. It matters how you feel through the experience. And so for me, if women can go through this program and if they end up in a C-section, they generally reflect on it in a really positive way, like they, were in control, felt empowered through the process, and had a positive experience despite the fact that things didn't go how they were hoping.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can even just think of conversations I've had. A lot of clients that we see sometimes are trying for not necessarily their first child, and so they've got a birth experience to reflect on. And even sometimes you hear some stories where you think naturally there might be, based on the events that were, some stories are certainly more extraordinary than others in terms of what unfolds on the day. But yeah, I guess the question I always ask is like, how do you feel about your last birth? Because I guess I'm also trying to unpack, are there other reasons why this person might be struggling beyond the nutritional, beyond the medical, that mind-body connection element? Like, do we need to unpack that? And sometimes a traumatic birth experience, whether, whatever has happened, events aside, can be part of that story. So yes, I'm often hearing people's birth stories in other contexts that some of you might be surprised to hear about. I do actually hear a lot of birth stories in my day-to-day work. So yeah, I think it's great that there's resources available. And it, like, in your opinion, I know we kind of briefly touched on this, but is it ever too early to seek out birth education in your opinion, Beck?
Well, the program that I teach, I generally recommend to start a program like that from around 20 weeks pregnant. So it's probably a good time to get into that prep. You then have some of that knowledge to start having conversations at your appointments, because a lot of the work can be done with your care provider during your pregnancy, not just during the labor itself. So doing that preparation earlier on in pregnancy, I think, is definitely beneficial. Like we mentioned earlier with the women that might have fears around this even prior to conceiving, I think informally starting to research and look into that positive birth space, because there is so much out there that could help shift those fears and start to open them up a little bit to what birth can look like outside of that conditioning of birth is traumatic and painful. I guess going back to that preconception phase, what I would say is a big way we manage fear and anxiety is through avoidance. So let's just, stick our head in the sand or under the covers and not even think about it, because it's scary or it's fearful or it causes us to feel uncomfortable. What this often does, the avoidance loop, is when we avoid something that's making us anxious, it reinforces the anxiety, and often the anxiety just gets worse. So what can be the most helpful thing to do is step out of your comfort zone, be open to feeling the anxiety and the fear and doing the thing anyway. So that might look like starting to read some positive birth stories or watch some positive birth videos, talking to people in a helpful way, care providers, professionals like yourself or like me, to start to shift some of those beliefs and fears around labour and birth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, normalizing that you might need some counselling or support around this in the preconception phase, and that is okay. And it's important that you seek the appropriate advice for the stage that you're at. And even though technically hypnobirthing is something that you would look at from 20 weeks, doesn't mean you can't seek other types of mental health support or counselling or having these conversations earlier. And sometimes it can be really hard to open up. Like when I say I've had these conversations with people, they've not, come to their Zoom consultation. They're like, Steph, I realize I'm self-sabotaging because I'm really scared about labor and delivery. That's not often the case. It's often, I'm sometimes 10, 12 consults deep with this person, and I'm starting to pick up patterns over a longer period of time, and they feel comfortable, and, you ask the right questions, and then something like this can come up. And obviously then I action a referral. But I think a lot of times you're not even aware. It's that subconsciousness of what's going on. Absolutely. So awareness is key. And whether you do that solo or with a healthcare provider, that's absolutely imperative.
And I do a lot of work with women in the preconception stage, that mind-body connection, working through the fears, exploring things like visualization and developing a positive expectation around even conceiving, to assist our body to be ready to conceive, because like you said, there's a lot of stuff that happens up here that is likely sabotaging and impacting our ability to conceive. So if you're listening to this and resonating with it, you are not alone. There's so many women that are in this space and probably doing a lot of the physical stuff to help with conception, seeing the dietitian, tracking the fertility, even linking in with fertility specialists in other areas, but aren't willing or haven't realized how big a part, stress, anxiety, fear has on that fertility process. So if that's you, definitely consider that as another option to support you on your conception journey.
Yeah, absolutely. You got to find your people, as I always say. You got to find your people who are going to support you. It takes a village, not just to necessarily raise a child, but takes a village to get pregnant and support you in pregnancy too. And we expect and know that people will rally around us once a baby arrives in most instances in our social circles. But a lot of what people go through preconception and early pregnancy, when emotions can sometimes even be running higher, are going through it in silence, just because of society and expectations. It's a whole nother topic for another day that I would love to talk about, but I will be here for another 45 minutes for sure. So yes, no, thank you. I really appreciate you bringing that up. Was there anything else you wanted to add, any tidbits or tips that you wanted to share with our listeners, Beck, before we sign off for today?
Probably my biggest piece of advice when preparing for birth is don't wing it. I think a lot of couples, women think, well, it's going to be painful and traumatic. I'll just hope for the best. Or, I believe in my body, but I'm just going to see what happens. So you could kind of be in either camp. But labor and birth, generally positive outcomes in labor and birth don't just happen. They happen through conscious effort, preparation, knowledge, power. So just like you wouldn't rock up to run a marathon and just think, today I'm going to run a marathon, let's see what happens. You're going to do a lot of work to prepare your mind and prepare your body for that physical event. Birth is no different. So the best thing you can do, especially if you're anxious, especially if you're fearful, even more important for you to do the work. Don't stick your head under the covers or in the sand. Do the work, prepare, link in with your team that can support you on this journey. And it can, I promise you, be the most incredible experience of your life. It can be such an empowering, amazing journey to be on, but you need to do the work.
Yeah, I love that marathon analogy. I use it all the time when I'm like, I see often a lot of pregnant women in their third trimester just as they're gone on maternity leave, and we talk about what to eat during labor to kind of help fuel them, because you just don't know how long it could be. It could be an hour. You could be in there for 2 days. Who knows? And they're like, oh, I didn't even think about food. I'm like, yep, think about food. Think about food for your partner so they're not leaving you to find food at an inconvenient time. We have to got a plan. They're like, oh my gosh, Steph, I did not even factor this into the hospital bag scenario. I'm like, yep, absolutely. We need to be thinking about these things because it is a marathon from a physical aspect as well as many others. But you don't go in blind. You do not go in eyes wide shut, as I say. You want to be eyes wide open as much as possible. Well, thank you so much for sharing your valuable expertise and your advice. I am so sure that this will be really, really helpful for our listeners. I know many people struggle with this, even if they aren't aware of it. Hopefully we've brought some awareness to them today. So where can people find out more about you and the Mindful Birth movement and all the amazing work that you do, Beck?
Thanks, Steph. So you can find me on Instagram. It's my favorite place to be. So at the Mindful Birth Movement. My website is www.themindfulbirthmovement.com.au. So feel free to get in touch, send me a DM, send me an email, or inquire on my website. I do hypnobirthing programs both face-to-face in Melbourne, and I run some online programs as well. So there's definitely options for you if you're not local to me. But yeah, I'd love to connect with you.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Beck. And for those who are listening, don't forget to share this with a family member, friend, or colleague who might be able to resonate with this topic. It really does help us reach more ears. Leave a rating and review on your favorite podcasting platform, Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And yeah, connect with us over on Instagram at @the_Dietologist. Send us a DM and let us know what you thought of the episode. All right, everyone, I'll catch you in the next episode. Bye.